Welcome back. This is part 2 of an existing series where I am doing a live build of a public API to allow users to pass through a YouTube URL and get back an extraction of the transcript. Now, I am going to be starting to code the solution in this video. Make sure you watch video 1 to understand the context of what we're doing. First, I am going to take a screenshot of this architecture because I want to provide the screenshot to my coder, which we are going to use Codex, and we're going to use that through Visual Studio, which I'm just going to bring up now. Visual Studio is a Microsoft product. It's free to download from the internet, so you can find it by searching Google for Microsoft Visual Studio Code. Now, you do need a subscription to Codex from OpenAI, and what you do is once you open up Microsoft Visual Studio Code, on the left-hand side, you'll see extensions, and you can search for Codex, okay? And it's the one by OpenAI. Make sure it has millions of downloads. You can see here we have over 5 million downloads to make sure it's the right one. And then you can install it. Here it says uninstall because I've already installed it. Once you do that, you will see this icon, okay? And if you click on that, that will open up the Codex chat window. I've got mine down here on the bottom of the screen. And then you can start to chat with Codex to ask it to do your coding tasks. Now, I'm going to paste in the image that, I'm just going to press Control V that I just created. Okay. Now, what I've done is I have created a new folder on my computer called Onboarding, and I've opened up that folder on my computer here using Microsoft Visual Studio Code. Now, I'm just going to make sure Codex understands the architecture. So I'm just going to ask it, do you understand the architecture in image.png, which is a YouTube transcript automation pipeline? Now, the reason I'm asking this question is because I want to make sure it understands the current architecture of the solution. And as I said, if you haven't watched video 1, then you should. Otherwise, you're not going to have an idea of what I'm trying to do here. So, okay, so what's it saying here? Let me give it the path. Okay, copy the path. So I'm just going to paste that in. There we go. Because it's saying I can't find it, so I'm not sure why. But anyway, there it is. So let's wait for Codex to respond, and then I can give it more information about what I'm trying to do. So here we go. Final transcript output goes to this. So it looks like it understands. So I'm now going to give it more information. I want to create a API endpoint that allows me to pass through a YouTube URL that then goes through this pipeline. Now let's just fix up this typo. Okay. And I'll give some more information. The API should simply first check to make sure the input is a valid YouTube link, and also validate the API key passed in by the user, and then store the YouTube video link in the required database table to kick off the transcript process. Now, it should understand what I'm trying to do. Now, there's more than just the API. Okay, so I'm going to give it more information. I also want you to create a user registration form where the user must supply their first name and their email address. And I want you to send the user a one-time password to their email address to verify their email address. Once the email address is verified, then the system should redirect the user to their dashboard, where I want you to allow the user to create an API key that they can use to create. Let's just fix that. They can use to call the new API endpoint that you will develop, allowing them to use this transcript automation pipeline. Let me know if you understand the requirement and provide me a brief of your understanding of this requirement, and let me know what you need to be able to access the database to allow the user's YouTube URL to kick off the transcript process. I also want you to apply rate limits where the user can only use the API 4 times in any given 60 minutes. Okay, so let's just fix this up. Use the API 4 times. Okay, so I'm just going to hit enter and just wait for the AI to respond and let me know. So I want to see that it understands the requirement, and I'm going to understand that by it telling me, it giving me its brief. So I'm waiting for it to give me its brief, and then what else it needs. It's going to need access to the database, So it's going to need some environment variables. So let's wait and see what it comes back with. Okay, so let's now go through this. So this is its understanding of the requirements. Now, anytime you use AI and you're giving it some instructions, always ask it to repeat its understanding, and then you need to validate its understanding. Okay, so number one, this is its understanding. Build a new authenticated API endpoint that accesses a YouTube URL. The endpoint must validate the API key, validate the URL is a real YouTube link, enforce rate limits, insert a new row into this table. Now, I got that from the image I sent it, right? It's documented the table, okay? And build a registration form, first name and email, and send an OTP, verify the OTP. After verification, redirect to the dashboard. Dashboard must let user generate and manage API keys. And what else? I also checked your current file that it only has a diagram. Yes, that's correct. So it's going to scaffold from scratch the app. Now, the tech stack is Next.js. That's fine. Now, this is not correct. It should have picked up that I'm using Vercel. This is correct database. This is now telling me what it needs, so I'll give it these things. Now it wants to know the structure, which I'll tell it to work it out. Once it has access to the database, it can go look at that table. Now, what else do we have? Use Supabase Auth, OTP. So it's asking me some questions. So let's first fix this up. Now, let me tell it a few things. Use Tailwind, CSS, and Shad CN for UI. Solution. Actually, let's say we will host on Vercel. Okay? So there's no need for... no, that's fine. I'll just let it work that out. Next.js is fine for the back end. Okay. What else? Supabase URL. Okay, I'll just say the database credentials will be available in the .env.local file. Gee, my narrator, he's really bad. .env.local. What else does it want? Auth model. I'm just going to say, yes, use Supabase. Let's also make a specific app users table for registered users of this app. Okay, so we'll need, I'd like to have that. Now, so that means must verify API key is valid and user, which is, I guess, the email, exists in app users table. Okay, so they've got to have a valid API key and they must be registered, right? I want that in the app specific users table. What else? Custom OTP table, yes. Email provider. So email provider is SendGrid. Already have keys and email and authenticated domain. Verified email. Okay. What else does want to know? Yep. So I've said we're going to use SendGrid. API key is going to be stored in the hash. That's fine. That's fine. Rate limit fine. Redis is fine. We can use Redis. Redis is how we can limit the usage we can use. Okay, let's continue. Let's see what it says. Now I've got to put in my environment.local file credentials to the database. I forgot to talk about this table. So let's wait for it to start doing its thing. Now, what I need to say here, verify the structure of the YT_jobs table with the existing database credentials that I will put into the environment file. I'm just going to click on yes for that. Let's fix this up. Don't know why it said that. Yes, go ahead. In the database, using credentials that I will add to .env.local. Okay. Now I've got to go and grab those things and put them in this file so that it can access the database. In the meantime, I'll let this continue and start building out the base. Okay, so what we can see is that Codex has created a new folder within my root folder called Transcript Portal. Okay, within there, it's created all these different files. Now, the one that's important for me right now is this environment.example file. Now, what this is a file that Codex has created telling me these are the variables that it needs to do its job. It needs to know the URL of the Supabase database. It needs some keys for the database. It needs the rate limiting keys and tokens. And it needs to know these specific columns within the YT jobs table. Okay. Now, I've created an environment.local file, which is here. And it has detected that file and it has seen that I've given some environment variables within there, keys and things that it needs. and it's saying that it wants to create a new .env.local file in this transcript portal. Okay, the .env.local file is where we put in all of our API keys and secrets. Okay, and it is never committed to our repository. I'll talk more about that when we deploy the solution. Okay, so I'm going to say yes, go ahead and copy the values from my .env.local file, okay, into the project, which is in that subdirectory called transcript portal, env.local file. Okay, I'm also going to say use the database credentials that I have provided to confirm the columns for the YouTube jobs table. Okay, so we'll let it go and do that, and basically I want it to copy whatever's in the environment file that I created into a new environment file. It's going to create inside of the project folder, which is transcript-portal, so that it can use that. Okay, it's given an example file of what we need to put into the .env.local file. Okay, which you can see is created there. I'm not clicking on it because it's going to contain my secrets, and those secrets are going to be in this format. It's already given us an example. Okay, and it's going to take what I put in here, which are, for example, the database URL. Okay, the keys to access the database, and I haven't given it the Redis details, which I'll go and do shortly, and it shouldn't need these anymore, right? It's asking me to provide it the column names for this table, but I've told it to go and check the database itself and work out what the column names are. Okay, so this is it now. It's gone in, it's identified the schema of that table that exists in my database. Okay, the reason it exists in the database is because I've already got a job running. If you remember the architecture I discussed in video 1, right? And you can see it's access the database and come back with the schema of that table. And now it's gone ahead and I'm going to say update the env.example file because we don't need to know. You now know the columns, right? So I now need to go into Upstash to configure the rate limiting so that I can apply rate limiting. Now, this is wrong. I don't want it to put this in the environment variables. Okay, so let me make this clear. Let's just say we do not need to add column names as environment variables. Okay, now I'm going to go and I'm going to set up Upstash for the rate limiting and then let this continue and then we can start testing it out. Okay, so I've logged into my Upstash account and I've gone to the developer API section, and for Codex I've created a new API. And what this should allow Codex to do is create a new Redis queue for rate limiting. Okay, so I'm going to go back into the Visual Studio and I'm going to give it this API key and then I'm going to tell it to go and create its own Redis queue using Upstash and grab the token and configure the rate limiting so that I can enforce the usage of my API to be simply 4 uses per hour. Okay, so I'm going to let it know that I have added a Upstash API key that you can use to create the Redis queue and grab the database and the required token and then update the environment variables. Okay, so hopefully you can use that and create what it needs rather than me having to create it manually. Okay, so there's a message here from Codex saying it's blocked and it found the Upstash API key, but it's saying that it also needs my email address because Upstash doesn't just allow you to provide its API key to create the Redis database, it also needs my email address. So I've added that in the environment.local file as it's asked me to do. So I'm just going to say done, and then I'm going to let this continue. Okay, now what it's trying to do is create the rate limiting. It's trying to configure the rate limiting for the API to enforce a maximum of 4 calls of my API per API key. Okay, so let's let this continue and wait for it to configure everything, and then we can test. Okay, so it has everything that it needs to build the solution. Let me talk a little bit more about the environment variables. Okay, now the environment.example file that Codex has built for us tells us what it needs to be able to function. And this is what you create locally in this file, .env.local, that allows me to run the system locally. When we deploy this, we will put those variables in the environment variables on the environment where we host the solution, which for me is going to be Vercel. And I'll talk about that when we get to that stage. So we need to provide all these different variables: the database URL, the database anon key, the service role key, and the URL for Upstash and the token for Upstash. Now, if you don't know what these are, you just simply go into ChatGPT or your favorite AI and just ask it, where do I get my next public Supabase URL? Okay, where do I get my Supabase service role key? And it'll tell you where to go in that platform and find that key. And then you just have to paste it in here, okay? And you need to do that in your .env.local file. I'm not clicking on that file because my values are in that file, okay? So in the next video, we will now start to test the application to see if it works and what are the changes we need to do.